Walter Bennett always believed that age was a matter of agreement. When he was 20, he thought that people turned into shadows at 70, silent, tired, detached. And you know what? Back then, in the early 1970s, he wouldn't have been far wrong. A 70-year-old person seemed to the world like someone who had outlived themselves. Old age was seen almost as a long-awaited finish line. A tired body, a quiet life, grandchildren, memories, saying goodbye to dreams. But today, standing on the threshold of his 8th decade, Walter feels the way he couldn't even imagine feeling in his youth. And he knows it's not a coincidence, not a lucky ticket. It's a change that has happened to the whole of society, a change that few people think about. We've gotten used to it so quickly that we haven't even realized how radically the very meaning of aging has changed. Want to know why 70 today isn't the end of the road, but its second chapter? Why what used to mean old age is now called new opportunities? Want to understand what invisible revolutions have overturned our perception of age in the last 50 years? I'll tell you about it. I'll tell you not only through figures and facts, but through stories, through the destinies of people, through changes in medicine, in culture, in the very perception of life. I'll tell you how aging has ceased to be a finish and has become a launching pad. But first, let's go back to where it all began, to a time when dreaming of life after 70 was still strange, almost indecent. And only then will we understand how far we've come, and why perhaps our best time is still ahead. If you enjoy thinking about how the world around us is changing, subscribe to the channel. Believe me, we'll have many more stories worth hearing ahead. In the 1970s, aging meant one simple thing: living within the framework of expectations that had been invented for you. No one said it out loud, but there was a strange agreement in the air. After 50, your task was to slow down, modestly step aside, and prepare for departure. Walter Bennett remembered how it was. His father retired at 62, the same year Walter graduated from college. Back then, it was considered normal, almost honorable. Dad put on his best jacket, received an engraved watch at his farewell party, and his new life began, or rather, its slow winding down: fishing, newspaper crossword puzzles, modest family dinners, without dreams, without new horizons. And no one saw tragedy in it. Aging at that time was perceived not as a sudden fall, but as a gradual fading, as if someone were carefully erasing the bright lines of your life until only a light shadow remained. If you had approached an ordinary 60-year-old person in 1975 and asked, "What are you dreaming about?" they would most likely have been confused. Dreams were for the young. Old age was for memories. Of course, people didn't lie on the couch all day. They lived, raised grandchildren, went to the shops, met with friends. But all this was colored with a different mood. The emphasis was not on creating something new, but on maintaining what remained. Walter recalled how Mrs. Harper, a neighbor, a lively woman with bright eyes, suddenly disappeared from local gatherings as soon as she turned 65. She didn't get sick. She simply retired, as they said back then. As if somewhere there was a secret mechanism that turned off the light when you crossed an invisible boundary. And it wasn't because they were weak or lazy. No, it was because that's how the culture itself worked. Age was a framework, a template. You lived your life, climbed the mountain of youth, reached the plateau of maturity. And after 50, you had to gradually go down, modestly and with dignity. Were there exceptions? Of course. Someone traveled. Someone opened small businesses. Someone wrote books. But they were seen more as a strange curiosity than as the norm. They were rare voices in the choir of those who chose silence. Think about it. How familiar does this feeling sound to you today? Do you have an internal fear of a certain number? How old do you consider to be the edge of the cliff, after which only the expectation of the end begins? And here arises the most important question. Why did we decide that age is a sentence? And what has changed to break this template? Walter Bennett knew the answer, and he was ready to tell it. Because the real story of change began not at parties, not in trendy gyms, and not even in the heads of dreamers. It began in hospitals, in laboratories, in the small offices of doctors who first wondered, what if aging could be slowed down? What if it doesn't necessarily have to look like this? And if you want to know exactly how science and medicine rewrote the very nature of old age, stay close. Next will be the story of the quietest but most important revolution of the last 50 years. Walter Bennett remembered how it all started. In the 1970s, diseases were treated when they had already made themselves known. Your heart was acting up? You waited until it got worse, and only then did you prescribe pills. Your joints creaked? You endured it, because knee replacement sounded like science fiction, expensive and risky. He recalled his uncle, a strong man, struck down by a heart attack at 56. Everyone around shrugged. Age, what can you do? As if the ailment was not an accident, but the signature of time from which there was no escape. But then the world began to change, quietly, imperceptibly, in operating rooms and laboratories. Medicine was rewriting the rules. Cardiac surgeons learned to repair hearts, turning a death sentence into a new chapter of life. Statins, these small pills, became invisible guardians, saving millions from heart attacks they weren't even aware of. Screenings, from mammograms to blood tests, began to catch diseases before they could take root. Vaccines protected not only children, but also adults, cutting off the path of pneumonia and flu, which were once considered companions of old age. It wasn't just treatment, it was a revolution of possibilities. Joint replacements returned the joy of movement to people, to dance again, to walk without pain again. Lasers corrected vision, and new teeth gave confident smiles. Medicine stopped accepting weakness, as if saying, you can remain yourself longer than you thought. Walter saw this in the example of his friend Bill, a skeptic who at 63 was persuaded to have a checkup, early tumor, quick operation, and now he's on the tennis court, laughing as if he were 30. It wasn't a fluke, but a new reality. The body no longer had to break down under the weight of years. Diseases that used to be accepted as fate became problems with solutions. Have you ever wondered that today, the average 70-year-old in developed countries has the physical performance of a 50-year-old 30 to 40 years ago? Imagine your grandmother or grandfather in 1975 and someone of their age today. Two different universes, two different stories. And yet Walter knew. Medicine had only done half the job. It gave years, but what to do with them? The answer was hidden not in hospitals, but in minds, there, where old age ceased to be a cage. Want to know how people learn to dream again, regardless of age? Then stay close. The story is only gathering momentum. If you're interested in watching how age is losing its old boundaries step by step, please like this video. So, I'll understand that this whole journey isn't just for me alone. Walter understood that you can patch up a heart, you can strengthen joints, you can straighten posture with lasers and replacements, but what's the point if the thought, my time has passed, still lives in your head? It was culture that became the next great revolution, imperceptible, quiet, almost capillary, like water penetrating the cracks in old walls. When Walter was young, the culture around him built old age as a very narrow corridor. The old man in the movies was either a funny quirk or a wise observer on the sidelines of events, but never a real protagonist. Newspapers wrote about records, about new projects, about love, and all these stories almost always concern the young. The feeling was this: life is a stage for the young, and with each decade you live, you are given a smaller role and taken further behind the scenes. But imperceptibly, everything began to change. At first, they were rare flashes, as if someone accidentally opened the door behind which another version of aging was hiding. One day, Walter saw an article about a woman who started rock climbing at 65. Back then, it seemed like a miracle, almost a joke, like news about a three-legged chicken. Everyone admired, but no one saw it as a new standard. 10 years passed, and there were more such stories. People who quit boring jobs and started their own businesses at 60. Men and women who at 70 went on round-the-world trips not as shaky tourists but as real pioneers. With each year, old age began to sound different. Not as the last chapter, but as a completely new volume, written in a different font. The world was slowly beginning to understand. Age is not a boundary of possibilities. It's just another coordinate on the map, and if you want, you can move on. Walter saw this in his friends, in Betsy, who started dancing salsa at 68, in Harvey, who at 71 suddenly realized that he had dreamed of learning to play the saxophone all his life, and started taking lessons, shy like a teenager. He saw it in himself when he first dared to go to a country he had dreamed of since his youth, but had always postponed. Later, when there's time. And that later turned out to be not at 30, not at 40, but at 69. Perhaps the most important change happened in people's minds. Films began to appear where elderly heroes were not comical grandmothers, but real fighters, dreamers, lovers. Books began to be published where the characters aged, but this aging did not take away their passion for life. Social networks appeared where 70-year-olds shared their stories, advice, dreams, and millions of young people liked them, admiring their freedom. And suddenly it became clear. Aging is not crumbling in the wind. It's a choice, and that choice was now in everyone's hands. When Walter reflected on this, he always asked the same question, himself and others. If age no longer puts a period, what prevents us from putting a comma and writing on? Because medicine gave people the opportunity to live longer, but culture gave the most valuable thing, permission to live brighter. No one looks away anymore when they see an elderly person starting to learn to dance or launching a startup. On the contrary, today it evokes admiration, a desire to follow them. That's why 70-year-old Walter was standing on this street now, not as a shadow of the past, but as a man who still has 1,000 plans ahead. But that wasn't the whole story yet. Even having changed the perception of aging, the world had not gotten rid of the challenges. Life had become longer, but with it came new complexities, new questions, to which there were no simple answers yet. Want to know what problems the world faces where aging has become a new form of youth? Then don't leave, because ahead is another important chapter. Walter Bennett often smiled, looking at how life had changed. But along with this smile, another feeling lived somewhere deep down. The feeling that every victory brings with it a new front in the struggle. Aging had become different. Yes, now it was full of life, energetic, open to dreams. But with it came challenges that no one had warned about. He recalled how his friend Tom, having celebrated his 70th birthday with a 5-mile run, once quietly confessed over a cup of coffee. Sometimes I'm scared. I seem to be the same inside. But now I realize that I have to live another 20, maybe 30 years, and I don't know how to live this time properly. And in these words sounded a truth that could not be dismissed. Life had become longer, but with it, new expectations had grown. The world, which used to carefully prepare for a quiet old age in an armchair by the fireplace, now demanded activity, ambition, achievement from people, regardless of age. Staying young at heart is not just an inspiring phrase, but almost an obligation to keep up, not to give up positions, not to be boring, not to be weak. Walter saw how many of his peers were experiencing pressure that their parents didn't even know about. At 60, they still had to be in shape. At 70, interesting conversationalists, active travelers, passionate learners of new skills. And if one of them dared to get tired, allowed himself to simply be old, the world looked at him almost with a slight reproach, as if he were violating an unspoken contract of the new era, to always be in resource. And then there were other, much more material problems. Pension systems, created in an era when life expectancy was much more modest, were beginning to creak under the weight of new realities. Working longer had become not only an opportunity, but also a necessity. Medical services had become a salvation, but also a heavy burden for those who couldn't afford them. Aging had become active, but it remained equal far from everyone. Walter sometimes thought about his acquaintances, for whom new opportunities remained behind glass. Not because they didn't want to live brighter, but because they didn't have the strength for it, neither physical nor financial. Aging had become something like a second marathon. Those who started in more advantageous conditions could run further and more joyfully. And someone, despite all the changes, still remained locked in old scenarios. Loneliness, poverty, disease. And that was another truth. A truth that was not shown on the pages of inspiring magazines. A truth that you wanted to turn away from, but that could not be ignored. And yet, despite all this, Walter believed the changes were for the better. Yes, with them came new questions, new fears, new injustices. But with them, the world got a chance to see aging not as a disaster, but as another great stage of life, complex, contradictory, but alive. When he looked at his friends, at people in gyms and university classes and art workshops, he understood. They weren't looking for eternal youth. They just wanted to live so that each of their days was filled with meaning, regardless of how many years were in their passport. And maybe that's the real secret of why 70 is the new 50 today. Not in rejuvenating creams, not in sports watches, not in fitness programs, but in the fact that people have finally dared to ask themselves the question, why should I stop dreaming just because I've lived another decade? And as long as they continue to seek answers, life will remain bigger, wider, and brighter than they were ever promised. Walter Bennett often thought about the strange arithmetic of time. It would seem that the numbers remained the same. 70 years is still 70 orbits of the Earth around the Sun. And yet, within these numbers, changes were taking place that could not be ignored. When Walter looked at his reflection in the shop window, he saw a gray-haired man with wrinkles in the corners of his eyes, with a slight swaying gait after a long walk. And yet, when he remembered what his grandfather was like at that age, the difference was deafening. Grandfather at 70 looked like a man who had long since left the race. Walter himself at 70 still felt the same internal spring that made him get up early in the morning, make plans for tomorrow, and dream about the future, not the past. And he knew it wasn't just about feelings. Science confirmed it again and again. The average 70-year-old today has the physical form, endurance, and health that were typical of 50-year-olds in the 1970s. Heart, lungs, muscles, all these systems lived longer, worked better, and resisted longer. What used to be perceived as an inevitable slowdown has now become more a matter of lifestyle choice than a cruel dictate of biology. But perhaps more important than muscle strength was the strength of thought. Walter noticed how the very psychology of age had changed. People had stopped perceiving each decade lived as an obstacle. Now, 50 is the beginning of a new career. 60 is the time to learn to dance the tango. 70 is a reason to go to a country whose name you couldn't even pronounce correctly a week ago. Aging had ceased to be a signal that it's over. It had become an invitation to a new turn in life. He remembered Judy, his neighbor, who at 67 founded an online business that she had dreamed of all her life, but had been afraid to even think about before. Remembered Frank, who at 73 met the woman of his dreams at watercolor lessons and proposed to her, standing on one knee, creaking with effort, but shining happier than any 20-year-old. And when Walter looked at them, he understood. It wasn't about the calendar. It was about the fact that people had finally allowed themselves to continue dreaming. Want to feel how much the world has changed? Ask yourself, how many stories have you heard about people who at 75 jumped out of a plane for the first time? About those who started learning a new language to work as a volunteer abroad? About those who moved to a new city, made new friends, started a new life, when previously they were only expected to quiet down in peace? These are not isolated cases. This is the new reality. And it doesn't mean that aging has become a game without rules. Of course the body changes. Of course energy is not endless. Of course there are diseases that cannot be completely defeated. But the main difference between then and now is that age is no longer perceived as a narrow corridor leading to the finish. Now it's more like an intersection. You can turn in any direction if you want. And this is perhaps the greatest change of the last 50 years. Not technology, not medicine, not fitness. But the fact that we have finally understood you can live to the fullest for as many years as you have. Walter Bennett believed in this with every cell of his body, with every smile in his 70s, and he knew the most important discoveries were yet to come, for him, for his friends, for everyone who isn't going to give up just because there are more candles on the cake than they'd like to count. And now the last question remained. What awaits us next? The world in which age has lost its former boundaries is preparing amazing but difficult times for us. Want to know what the future of aging might be like? Then stay with me. The last chapter is ahead. Walter Bennett often caught himself thinking that he lived in an amazing time, on the border of two worlds. Behind him was an era where aging meant only silence and departure. Ahead of him spread a world that was only just learning to understand what it means to live long, and really live, not just exist. The future of aging promised amazing opportunities. It was already visible how the very fabric of society was changing. Age was ceasing to be an obstacle to dreams, was beginning to be just another characteristic, like eye color or height. People at 70 were starting to learn programming at 80, launching authors' courses in design at 90, telling stories and podcasts that were listened to by thousands of young subscribers. Generations, which were once separated by an almost insurmountable wall, were beginning to intertwine, learn from each other, and work together. Walter saw this in his own family, how his eldest grandson taught him how to use video editing programs, and he himself told his grandson how to live without fear of failure. Aging was ceasing to be a removal from society. It was becoming a dialogue. And yet, behind all these bright pictures, the future hid new challenges. Life was becoming longer, but the world was not fully ready to support it properly. Pension systems, which were built for the old rhythm of life, were beginning to creak under the weight of new realities. A person who previously counted on 20 years of rest after 65 now found himself facing a dilemma: to work longer, to change careers, to revise his dreams of a well-deserved pension. Medicine prolonged life, but prolonging life cost money, and not everyone had access to it. Walter saw how his friends, living in different parts of the country, faced this reality. For some, healthy aging was becoming a great opportunity. For others, a difficult struggle for every day without pain. The inequality that had always existed in society was now beginning to manifest itself in the very process of aging. Somewhere people at 80 were learning to dance salsa, and somewhere at 60 they could barely climb the stairs due to lack of quality medical care. And there were questions to which no one knew the answers yet. What will happen to the concept of a pension if you have to work until 75 or 80 years? What will happen to the economy if 80% of society remains active until old age? And the funniest thing, will young people envy the energy of their grandmothers and grandfathers instead of pitying them? Walter sometimes chuckled at this thought. He had seen young people who sighed heavily after a short climb up the stairs, and elderly people who were cheerfully finishing the marathon. Maybe, very soon, the words youth and energy will cease to be synonyms. Maybe we all will have to revise not only the concept of age, but also the concept of maturity. There were no ready answers in this future, only open doors, only opportunities that could turn out to be both a miracle and a new test. Walter believed in only one thing: age will never dictate how you should live. This dictatorship had collapsed. And what we build in its place will depend on everyone, on the willingness to learn new things, on the desire not to give up in the face of difficulties, on the ability to dream despite everything. And now, standing on the border of time, he felt a strange, warm feeling, not fear, not fatigue, not regret, but gratitude, for living in a world where aging had become not the end, but the beginning of a new endless road. And if you believe that life is not about the numbers in your passport, but about how many dreams you still have, subscribe and stay with us. This story is just beginning. Time is a strange thing. It moves quietly, without fuss, but one day you look back and see how everything has changed. Walter Bennett stopped at the shop window, catching his reflection, gray hair, wrinkles, but eyes still burning with curiosity. 70 years? It's not a sentence, but an invitation. His generation has turned the rules upside down. Where silence was expected before, now there are steps of new beginnings. Old age? No, it's a road, with turns, climbs, sometimes bumps, but so alive that it takes your breath away. He thought about friends who at 70 were learning languages, launching projects, falling in love as if they were 20, about a world where age had ceased to be a cage and had become a canvas. Draw what you want. Yes, there are questions ahead. How to make a long life accessible to all. How not to lose the spark in the hustle and bustle of new expectations. But the main thing has already happened. We have decided that you can always dream. Walter smiled, knowing his best is yet to come. And yours too. What will you choose? At 50, 70, or 90? A new language? A distant journey? Or just the courage to say not everything yet? Age is a number, and life is your move. Make it. Today, now, while the road calls.